Did Trump just tell us his plan to weaken the dollar and quote unquote solve the national debt crisis? So, yesterday we had the FOMC meeting, which took up a lot of attention, including ours. But there was a very, very important press conference, well, impromptu press conference that Trump gave with some really big news, I think. I think he's starting to tell us what his plan is. And there's huge implications for not only the dollar, but also the debt and inflation. So let's get into it. So, context, here's the dollar as measured by the DXY index. This is the dollar's value versus other fiat currencies. And what we can see is that going back to '08, the dollar has been in an uptrend. Okay. Well, it's retraced about 7%, about 4% there. Actually, excuse me, about 8% over the past 2 quarters. It has retraced about 8% and is approaching this critical kind of support area down in kind of the mid to upper 90s. If it breaks there, it'll be breaking a 18-year uptrend. So this is the context for the dollar. Now, what did Trump say? So he started the press conference by saying, I don't want to play it because of copyright issues, maybe, but you can find it on CNBC. I took a little transcript. So he said about Jerome Powell, he said, he's done a poor job. We have no inflation, only success. So I'd like to see interest rates come down. Now, Biden did a lot of short term debt. So we have short term debt coming due. And because of this guy's rates, referring to Powell, if he lowered by a point, I'd pay about a point less, a 1 percentage point, he's saying. If he lowered by 2 points, I'd pay about 2 points less. And that's for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. It's hundreds of billions of dollars, even trillions, that we're going to lose because of too late. I call him too late. So it's a juvenile nickname he has for Powell. So anyway, we should be 2 points lower. I'd like to be 2.5 points lower. We'd be saving 800, $700 billion. Then he goes on to talk about the European area and how they've cut their short-term rates much more than we've cut ours. He said, what I'm going to do is go very short term, like 6, 7, 8 months. Wait till this guy gets out, get the rates way down. And remember, he said we should be 2.5 percentage points lower, 250 basis points lower. Wait till this guy gets out, get the rates way down, and then go long term. So what he's talking about is lowering the overnight interest rate, that federal funds rate, and issuing all the debt at that short end of the yield curve, and then eventually kind of terming out the debt with longer term US Treasury debt. So a little bit of context. So what he is correct in referring to the comments about the Biden administration. Under the prior administration, due to a number of reasons, number one being kind of poor demand, waning demand, at least, I shouldn't say poor demand, waning demand over the past decade for long-term debt. Point number one. Point number two, tremendous volatility with long-term debt. And number three, as an effort to stimulate the economy, the Biden administration under Treasury Secretary Yellen shifted a huge amount of debt issuance towards the front end of the yield curve, the short end of the yield curve. You can think a 3-week Treasury bill, 1 month, 3 month, very, very short term debt. Okay, well, it's stimulatory. It has less volatility, which means it can be more easily levered up. Remember, Treasury bonds and bills are the collateral for the entire financial system. They're used as the collateral to lever up and create kind of private bank credit, which many people get in their kind of bank account as dollars, but it really was created by a bank using a US Treasury as collateral. These shorter term bills are much more cash like, they're much more liquid like. And not only that, but by reducing the amount of issuance being issued at the long end of the yield curve, you effectively bring down long term rates. You kind of artificially suppress long term rates. And some people have studied this. You can find the paper called Activist Treasury Issuance, found that the 10-year was suppressed by about 50 basis points by doing this. Now, it's stimulatory, it's inflationary, right? Because shorter bills are more cash-like, they're more liquid, they're more easily levered, they're less volatile, as Michael Howell talks about. But there are downsides to it. And the downside is exactly what Trump pointed out. And so we find ourselves in a position here. Here we have the government debt in blue, and we have the Treasury general account in red. This red line is the government's checking account. So when this line is going up, you can think of this as money being removed from the system. When this line is going down, this is dollars being pumped into the system. The blue line, as we can see, has flatlined. Well, why is this? This started back in December of 2024. This flatlined because the debt ceiling. And so the government is approaching the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling must be lifted. And if not, we won't be able to increase our debt. So all the debt being issued currently is not actually a net increase to the overall national debt. It is just refinancing. And what Trump is pointing out is that when you rely so much on short-term bills to fund your government, you become beholden to that overnight rate. And that overnight rate dictates the interest that you pay. And so he is correct by pointing out that dynamic. And we find ourselves in a situation where the Treasury general account is running low, the debt ceiling has not been solved and not been raised, and the Treasury general checking account is kind of running out of money. We could see it had at its peak here, a peak of about $1 trillion. $930 billion, and we are currently sitting at only $330 billion. So here, very quickly, there's something called the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee, the TBAC. You can find all this on treasury.gov. They talk about issuance. There is this quarterly refunding announcement that comes out quarterly. This talks about the debt, the way that they're going to issue, right? How much of each duration that they're going to issue. And here I will leave it up very quick, very short. So you can see that in general, we are issuing much, much more short-term debt. Remember, this whole scheme started in 22, 23. So this quote unquote historical reference is not really that historical. We used to issue much more 20 and 30s. But anyways, the point here is that you can see the 2-year, the 3-year, right? That is where we're issuing a lot of debt. They don't show Treasury bills, but we also issue a lot of debt at that very short end in what are known as Treasury bills. So there are consequences to this, right? What Trump is saying is that by being beholden to this overnight interest rate, because remember, one key point here to really kind of clarify. When if you bought a 1-month Treasury bill last month, say on May 19th, and that bill is coming due, right? It's coming to maturity. You want your $1,000 back from the government. Okay. The government does not give you your $1,000 in principal back out of tax dollars. What they do is they issue another bond, right? Get real dollars from issuing this new bond, get those dollars, and then give them to you, right? So they are paying off the old debt holders with new debt, with money for new debt. So we're constantly refinancing the debt. That is one of the downsides. Not only is it more stimulatory, and not only are you more beholden to this overnight interest rate, but also you have to roll it constantly. And so the issue here is that by not cutting rates, currently the average interest rate on the debt, here is the yield curve. Currently the average interest rate on the debt is 3.3, which is right here. You can see that there is nowhere on the yield curve where we could issue at 3.3. So Trump is correct that for every 50 basis points we can bring down in terms of the interest rate, we save $185 billion in interest. Now, remember, interest expense is the fastest growing budget item for the U.S. government, is now more than defense spending, and it is now over $1.1 trillion and more than defense spending. The interest is certainly a problem, and Trump is correct to kind of accurately identify these dynamics that, right, we've become beholden to this overnight interest rate. This is where most of the debt is being issued and refinanced. We need to get that short-term rate down. Well, there are consequences to this. This is what every emerging market has always done. It's the typical emerging market that is overly indebted. It is their playbook. What they'll do is they'll cut that overnight rate, right? The federal funds rate, or whatever their central bank's rate is called, right? The overnight interest rate that the central bank controls. They will cut that rate very low. And as you can see from the 3-month this is a very short-term bill, you can see that it basically just follows the white line. This white line is the federal funds rate. And you can see that short-term, the shorter maturity the bond is, the more it follows the white line. And so I think that this is generally what they're saying they're going to try. They're going to try to run the emerging market playbook of just cut that overnight interest rate, bring it down, issue all the debt there, and by Trump's own words, then later on we will refi the debt at the long end, right? We'll lock in and refi and issue some debt at lower rates on the 10 and 30. Well, a couple things. Number one, I'm going to take off the shorter maturities here. Look at when and take off the 5, the belly of the curve. So here, look at the long-term rates. Look at the 10 and the 30-year. Look at when they bottomed in terms of yield, right? This is when they peaked in terms of value. Remember, those are inverse. They peaked, or they peaked in value, or saw a bottom in yield right before the Fed started to cut. The Fed started to cut, and what did they do? They only went up. And why is this? This is because while the short-term maturities might follow the federal funds rate, the overnight central bank rate, the longer-term bonds do not. These operate much more on growth, inflation, credit risk, those sorts of things, right? If there are any fiscal issues, you see that in the 10 and the 30, not in a short-term bill. And so what we've seen is that was the bottom in long-term interest rates, was right before the Fed started to cut. Well, normally when the Fed cuts rates, rates come down across the curve. That's not what happened. We saw the opposite thing happen. We saw them go up. And this is called a curve steepening. So that the spread between, say, the 30-year, as seen in purple, and the yellow, which is a very short-term maturity, you can see how that is widening, right? And we can see that reflected here, kind of maybe easier to see in the white line here. What this white line shows is the 30-year yield minus the 2-year yield. Anything below the yellow line is, which is 0, is what's called an inverted yield curve. That is where you're getting lower interest rate on the 30-year than you are on the short-term bond. This is not how it normally is, as you can see from history going back to the 80s. Generally, the curve is not inverted. Well, we were inverted. A lot of people paid a lot of attention to this, but remember the point I made about activist Treasury issuance. They hypothesized that brought down the 10-year yield by 50 basis points, if not more. But the curve uninverted as soon as the Fed started to cut. So this is when I'll kind of zoom in. This is when the Fed started to cut interest rates. And you can see that is exactly when the curve uninverted got steeper. As this white line is going up, that is a steepening of the yield curve. That means that the rate on the 30-year yield is increasing faster than the 2-year yield. That is what this white line going up indicates, a positive spread. Right now, it's about 1 percentage point. You can see that with that 50 basis point jumbo cut, we uninverted, the curve steepened, long-term rates went meaningfully higher, as we could see from the kind of full curve here, or at least the 3-month versus the 10 and the 30. You can see that as soon as the Fed started to cut, rates just went the opposite direction. They went up. They did not go down, which is historically what's happened. Well, why is that? Well, I think the bond market is finally waking up to this playbook. Okay, we're going to just cut that overnight interest rate, issue all of our debt at that short-term, say a 1-month or a 3-month Treasury bill, issue all the debt way down here, right? Cut rates really low, issue all of our debt way down here, and that'll be our quote unquote solution. Well, there are consequences. Remember, we said that those shorter term bonds are more liquid due to having lower volatility and being more cash-like. This is stimulatory. This would be inflationary. Well, what do you think the 10 and the 30-year yield, which are supposed to approximate, right, and price in inflation risk, what do you think that those will do when they see, this kind of desperate government attempt to cut the very short-term rate, which they control, and just issue all the debt there? Well, they know that's inflationary for the reasons we've outlined in this video and others. And so long-term rates would go up, not down, right? The bond market is smart enough to recognize this is the playbook of a failing kind of, overly indebted sort of government. It'd be very inflationary, which would cause long-term rates to go up. and very stimulatory in terms of nominal growth. Remember, nominal growth right now is right around the cost of the debt, right? Generally, nominal growth, as seen in white, has been above the cost of the debt. So long as that is the case, everything's good for the government. But what we see now is the opposite thing happening, right? We see yields moving up and nominal growth moving down. Some of these have crossed already. The 30-year, for example, has crossed already. The 20-year yield has crossed already. The 10-year yield is right about to cross. As those longer rates move higher above nominal growth, that is when the debt becomes an issue. And this would certainly, remember, nominal growth includes inflation. So if by running this playbook, they are able to increase nominal growth by not increasing real growth, right? But by increasing the other component of nominal growth, which is inflation, if they are able to increase inflation, that would make nominal growth move higher. But what do you think long-term rates would do if they sense higher inflation? Well, they would also move higher. So you're really betting that you're smarter than the bond market. And that's not a bet that I would be willing to make. The last point I would make with this, generally, when you see governments run this playbook, it substantially weakens the currency because the world can see they are smart enough. If some nerd like me can figure this stuff out, best believe that global market participants can figure this out. They know that this playbook of we're just going to cut by 2.5%, get the federal funds rate down to 2, I guess, and just issue all of the debt at the short end, like a payday financing for the U.S. government. They know that that is a sign. Number one, they know it's stimulatory. And number two, they know that that is a sign of an overly indebted government that is having to take increasingly desperate measures. Well, what would happen to the dollar? The dollar would sell off. And I think that we could be kind of approaching a decision point. This is a quarterly chart. The Chairman Powell's term is up in about 6 or 7 months, if memory serves. So, what Trump is talking about doing is going to be inflationary. And the other thing to remember for the average American, I always say, this short term, this white line, this federal funds rate does not matter to you. The things that you care about, your credit card, your car loan, your mortgage, those are priced off of long-term bonds, like the blue line or the purple line. So if long-term bond yields are moving higher, right, because they recognize this kind of failing government playbook and higher inflation, more desperate measures, and all these sorts of dynamics, if they recognize that long-term rates move higher, that is going to hurt. If the housing market isn't on its last legs already, it certainly will be. And so I think that these are the real world impacts that we should start to look at, because I think Trump basically just told us what his plan is to quote unquote solve the debt. And it's very stimulatory. It's very emerging market like. And his delusion that, we'll be able to, long-term rates will come down in this environment and we'll be able to refi the debt out there, that's a delusion. Long-term rates would be much higher. I mean, going back to the yield curve here, this white line that shows the 30-year minus the 2-year, I would expect this to move to 2.5, 3, 3.5, somewhere like that. So long-term rates will be substantially higher than short-term rates. The curve will steepen. That's what people are referring to. So long-term rates will go up faster than short-term rates are coming down. And eventually it'll get to a point where they cannot afford, right, because it's killing the housing market, which is a huge component of the U.S. economy. Eventually, long-term rates get so high that it stifles economic growth so much that they have to do an Operation Twist-like thing where they issue debt at the short end of the yield curve, get dollars, right, take those dollars and then go buy down their long-term debt, the U.S. government's own long-term debt, to bring down the long-term rates. You can look up Operation Twist. It's a similar concept to that. It's basically yield curve control, QE, whatever you want to call it. And that is also very inflationary. So anyways, I think that those comments yesterday were super, super important. and not a lot of people are talking about them. I also think the likelihood of a shadow Fed chair increased dramatically with the Fed holding and not cutting rates yesterday. So I would recommend, I will put it at the end of this video, to recommend watching that if you haven't already. I think the likelihood of that is becoming higher with the day. So I would also take a look at that video. But anyways, hopefully that was helpful in terms of kind of preparing for what it appears their playbook is going to be, and the consequences. I mean, we could see the dollar in a secular bear market down to, I don't know, the 80s or the 70s. Remember, heading into '08, it was as low as 71. And that was following the secular bear market, following the burst of the dot-com bubble. And again, remember, this is what the Trump administration wants. The dollar is grossly overvalued, and this is preventing US goods from being competitive in the global marketplace, right? The dollar is grossly overvalued, as we've talked about numerous times for over a year and a half. They need a weaker dollar. Tariffs alone were never going to make US made goods competitive. They need a weaker dollar because the dollar is grossly overvalued. They need the dollar to return to fair value, which is significantly lower than it currently is. I would probably say at least 70, if not maybe even in the 60s. Different people have different levels for where that fair value would be. I think it needs to be substantially weaker versus things like the Chinese yuan. And I think eventually, part of it will be done through policy, right? We could see the dollar sell off, by the way, I will note on these comments. He made these comments yesterday, and the dollar sold off sharply. As you can see here. Now, it was just an intraday move, right? It's not anything really super notable, but I do think it was interesting that the dollar sold off, had significant selling pressure here on those comments yesterday morning when Trump was saying it. Because look, it's the emerging market playbook. It's not good for the currency, but at the end of the day, the administration needs a weaker dollar to accomplish their goal of reindustrialization and kind of make America great again, right? All the things that they've talked about wanting, they need a fairly valued dollar, and the dollar is grossly overvalued. And so this is one way to get a weaker dollar. Now, again, there are consequences. Steeper yield curve until eventually the yield curve long-term rates get so high that they have to inflate. They have to do even more inflationary things like yield curve control or QE to bring down rates at the long end. There's a lot of risks with this, but I think that Trump just kind of telegraphed and told the world what he plans to do. So, anyways, hopefully that was helpful and maybe like preparing for that eventuality. And I will catch you in the next one.